if you're an IT professional. And here to tell us more about it, Mr. Wes Bryan. All right, Wes, what are we going to dive into when we start talking about the idea of connection types here?
Try to demystify that, because like you said, Ronnie, maybe we have some home users out there that are only familiar with, one connection type, maybe that little modem they have in their house. Well, when you are in the industry, there are a variety of types that you can actually use in order to connect, and they have some pros and cons, and that's what we're going to do in this episode. First, to identify what they are, talk about them, and then do a little bit of compare and contrast.
Well, it sounds like it's time for us to get started. Head on over to the bench.
All right, everyone, come on over here, and don't worry, we didn't steal Ronnie's credit card or anything before the show. We are going to go ahead, though, and we're going to look at a few providers, because when it comes to internet connection types, you're typically going to go through an internet service provider. And in no particular order, we're just going to go ahead and we'll talk about some of the options. One of the very first ones that's actually been around for a bit and is now becoming a little bit more available in the residential markets is what is known as fiber optic internet connections, right? Fiber optic, you can see that there are a variety of technologies. Maybe you've heard of Verizon's Fios, right? That's the fiber optic internet service, if you will. For instance, AT&T has business class fiber optics here. So to kind of show you this, you can see that you're going to pay a penny, but notice some of the speeds that you can get. And that's one of the things that I really want you all to pay attention to. Fiber optic internet connections have about one of the longest transmission distances of all of our bounded cable type media. They provide very high speed internet connections, but as you can see, they do come with a price, and you can see that you can get things like gigabit internet speed. So fiber optic communications, keep in mind, it's one of the more expensive type internet connections, but it is one that provides you with a great amount of bandwidth. And well, the more money you throw at the internet service provider, you can get all the way up to a gigabit and sometimes even beyond, depending on the area. And that is one thing that I want you to keep in mind. We're going to mention some of these, but some of these are available in certain areas and some of them are not available in certain areas. And that's one of the things about fiber. Fiber, we're relying upon those providers who have they've laid the fiber, right? So pay attention to the availability in your local area. That's going to be important.
That's probably one of the most important aspects, especially if you're going to be a support technician for somebody looking to actually get into fiber. You may have to actually investigate which one is actually going to be available for you. You may find out one type is available, but the other one isn't. So make sure you do a little bit more investigative research as you go on there. Now, because of that availability, right, because people are actually now planting or, installing more and more fiber optic lines, it's going to become more readily available. But right now, it still isn't the most readily available. What we tend to see out there, though, is something like cable, right?
Absolutely, Ronnie. Cable internet. Let's just talk about the cable technologies in general. When we talk about cable, we're talking about the coaxial cable type implementations when it comes to network communications. Coaxial cables are probably one of the oldest network technologies we have in the industry today. And if it wasn't for certain technologies, it might have fell by the wayside with for instance, things like fiber optic communications coming online. But cable uses a coaxial cabling, and it typically is an RJ6 cable. And if you have, any of you have seen, maybe have a cable modem, you'll see that you have a coaxial cable coming out of the wall going into the back of that modem. Now, the cable modems, if you will, I also want to just mention briefly a standard that I want you to associate with cable modems, because cable modems allow you to not only send things like internet, but TV and phone across a single cable. And they use a technology called DOCSIS. That's the Data Over Cable Service Interface Specification. The thing that I want you to know about DOCSIS, very generically, it's the specification that allowed us to adapt to do new types of communication and allow that data to flow over those cable lines, if you will. Again, one of the things I want to keep you in mind of is the fact that the cable internet is a shared bandwidth, which is one of the reasons you might see speeds fluctuate. You might see that, hey, right there at 8 a.m. when everybody gets to work, we start to see performance kind of wane a little bit, or maybe you get home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, whichever time zone you might be in, and you start to notice that speeds drop. Well, with a cable communication, a cable internet type, you have, let's say, your piece of the pie. You have a shared connection with other people that are within your areas. So we can kind of look at, just some of the plans out there so you can get an idea of some of the speeds. Believe it or not, we can get, if it wasn't for that DOCSIS specification, we wouldn't be getting some of the speeds that we see comparable to other internet technologies today. Notice that we can get internet anywhere from 50 megs all the way up to 1 gigabit. All right, and we can also get TV if we want to, not included in the package, but here to see that it's a convergence technology where you have multiple communication types going over a single internet connection. You can also potentially do things like phone over those communication types as well. Keep in mind that these are one of the most prevalent, if you will, internet connection types that you see today, and especially in residential areas, it certainly is one of the more common types that you might have to support. So in a certification exam, I would know some of the specifications. When it comes to if you're in a support role, you should be aware of this one because it's one of the potential internet connections that you'll see the most.
Yeah, there's no doubt that probably one of the biggest complaints that you do hear from people getting cable internet for the first time is that sometimes it actually seems like the fastest thing that they've ever been on for their connections, and then other times it's actually slower, and that's because what Wes had mentioned here, which is the shared access that we tend to have. So when everybody's at home and everybody's streaming Netflix and doing whatever else, you're going to see, of course, speeds get slower. But you might find out, like during the middle of the night or a little, when people are actually asleep or they're not home, you get really good speeds that actually kind of go up to what they actually say that it's going to go up to. There is a way that we can prevent this, which is by actually trying to get what we call some type of service level agreement to do so, but that's going to be much more expensive. But it is more widely distributed at this point in time than what we see in terms of fiber. But Wes, even more widely distributed than that is what we call the idea of dial-up here. So Wes, this is pretty legacy at this point. What do we need to know about dial-up?
It sure is. Some people might say, well, we're recording this in 2022. Some people might say, man, you're talking about dial-up. What a legacy or antiquated technology that is. Yes, but it's still heavily used. And why is that? And that's because telephone lines have been around since the 1800s. So it is one of the widest deployed communication technologies out there. And these lines that I'm talking about, these telephone lines, are what is known as a public switched telephone network, all right, PSTN. Dial-up, if you will, I'll show you that, yes, it is still available, and yes, you still can buy it. It is a low-cost, low-speed communication technology, and I want you to get over the high-speed accelerated dial-up. That's not what I want you to focus on, because that's kind of a niche market, right? This free dial-up that you see, 10 hours a month, this is the one that was probably more common, and that's one that gives you the 56 kilobytes per second speeds. Dial-up is still in use in areas where there aren't cables that can be run, where there isn't maybe the ability to, for whatever reason or another, have satellite. I will tell you, you also will see things like dial-up used in disaster recovery when your other network connections get hit with natural disasters. Because of so many phone lines being available, it can still be used in disaster recovery. So yes, everyone, I know it's a legacy technology. We put it in here because if you're in a certification endeavor, you might see it on an exam. And if you happen to work in an industry where maybe you're doing some kind of disaster recovery, you might see them bring in these devices called modems that modulate and demodulate those analog signals from your computer, or the digital signals, from your computer, modulate them, and then send them over an analog telephone line to its source, or its destination, I should say. So that's your dial-up. Keep in mind, low cost, low speed alternative when it comes to an internet connection type.
Yeah, with that, along with that, natural disasters and different things, one of the things you can count on, especially with the idea of dial-up here, is that it will pretty much be one of the first systems that's actually going to be up if it goes down. Most of the telephone lines that we tend to actually hear about today, they're already buried cable and not really susceptible to a lot. Now, I can't say it's actually like, it won't be taken down at all, but usually if it is, it's actually going to be one of the systems that is going to be brought up first. So this is why it is important for things like what Wes was talking about in terms of disaster recovery. You need to ensure that you actually get up, your connection back up and first going. Well, dial-up may be an alternative plan for you. Now, along with that, and something that piggybacks off of the idea of dial-up a little bit here, is DSL. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So that's digital subscriber line. And digital subscriber line, if you will, is digital signals, just like Ronnie was kind of alluding to, that are basically modulated and sent over PSTN lines as well, those telephone lines. One of the benefits about this is the fact that you can actually separate the telephone signal and the data signal, so you can use your telephone and you can use the internet at the same time. With that legacy technology of dial-up, if you are dialing up on the modem, you cannot use your home landline. So DSL gives you this ability that you can use existing telephone lines and send digital signals. You can also use the telephone and the internet at the same time. But here's another thing too. It also allows for a lot greater speeds than the dial-up days did. Now, I do want you to understand that the speeds that DSL gets is directly related to the distance from the telecommunication provider switch. So there's all kinds of different speeds. There's speeds that I've seen that are up to around about 200 megabits. But you had to be very, very close to the telecommunication switch. And that's one of the limitations to DSL, is that DSL has a maximum distance of around 18,000 feet that it can operate away from your telecommunication provider. So there's a limitation on that. DSL can be deployed as long as you're close to that provider. It does use a modem, and let me show you, because there are some DSL providers out there. I just happen to have AT&T's pack it up, and one of the things I want to show you is that this isn't uncommon for DSL. Notice that we have a download speed of around 100 megabytes, but we have an upload speed of around 20 megabytes. So why are those different? Well, there's only really one specific DSL technology that I really want you to pay attention to. It's one of the most common, and that's called asynchronous, ADSL. And the asynchronous just means that the upload speeds and the download speeds do not match. So big takeaways from DSL is the fact that you can use those existing telephone lines as well as use your telephone and internet at the same time. Speeds and availability are directly related to the proximity of the telecommunication provider.
Yeah, that actually kind of makes sense. Again, one of the things that you will also hear, especially with DSL, the further away you are with the switch, more likely the slower your connection is going to be. So even if they offer you whatever that DSL connection is and it says 20 megabits, right? Well, that's probably pretty close to that switch that Wes was mentioning. But as you head towards that 1 mile, or half a mile mark, whatever it is, 18,000 feet of I can't remember, 5,200. So about 2.5, 3 miles or so. Yeah. Once you get closer to that 3 mile limit, you're going to start finding out something, that your speeds are going to drop dramatically, even though you have that same DSL connection, because it is further away.
Absolutely. It could drop as low as like 1 meg.
Oh, yeah.
So again, as you get farther. Ronnie, there's another technology that, we've talked a lot of technologies that kind of bind us to a certain location, right? We've talked about fiber, we've talked about cable, we've talked about dial-up and DSL, but these are very limiting in the fact that they require a physical bounded connection. Well, there are times when you live in areas where companies just don't lay cabling. Companies, you're too far away from a telecommunication provider to even consider DSL, if you will. There may not be any telephone lines in the area that you're in. So we have a couple of technologies that allow us to get over the physical limitations of cabling when it's just not feasible, especially in rural areas. And one of those is going to be known as cellular communications. Now, cellular communications, ladies and gentlemen, these are exactly what you are using on your cell phone. But the good thing is anymore, it's not just restrictive to just, I have to have a cell phone to have a cellular communication. Let me show you what I mean here. So for instance, we have T-Mobile. And again, we're not endorsing any one of these products, but you can utilize it as a training, resource, if you will. So what are we doing here? What is this? Well, this is a cellular access point, and it allows you to set up a 5G gateway. fifth generation, right? We're using technologies like LTE. We're using technologies potentially like CDMA, UTMS-based networks, and it allows us to jump on cellular networks to obtain our connections. One of the things that is great about this, that it's going to differ from the next one that we're going to talk about, is that this allows you mobile wireless internet access. And that's one of the key points to remember for this internet connection type.
Yeah, this particular technology does rely on those different towers, and they're spaced apart. So hopefully what happens is you can actually continue to drive and not drop that connection that actually seems like a big drop at all. Now, with that though, that is not the farthest, in other words, that's not the longest distance type of connection that we have. With the idea of wireless here, essentially, Wes, we have to talk about satellite, which is actually completely unbounded even to the Earth.
That is true. They're very true. So satellite is probably one of the farthest reaching wireless transmission mechanisms, methods, if you will, that we have. So satellites, it uses a satellite in orbit, and it transmits to a base station that turns around and transmits potentially to your satellite dish. So for instance, give you an example here, I just happen to have Starlink up, and they kind of show you their satellite dish here, and they tell you that it's low latency broadband internet, here's the kicker, across the globe, like Ronnie said. So what's the difference between cellular? Basically what this is more for is this is for fixed wireless communication, right? There is the ability to have mobile satellite communications if you ever see like a weather truck past you, but they're very expensive, right? I want you to think of things like Dish TV, Dish Network, right? These are examples of satellite communications. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind about this one, and really cellular communications in general, is that they're affected by the weather. So while they do allow us the flexibility of not having to lay physical cabling, they also come with some things that can affect them. Atmospheric conditions, if you will, signal propagation. It's all something to take in mind or keep in mind when you are going to either recommend or be using these technologies.
Yeah, no, it's not only weather. If a bird decides to land on your dish, you're kind of out. I mean, you really are. So anything that blocks that signal is pretty much the key, right? So this we tend to see, like we said, in those areas where they're not going to run any type of upgrade to the existing telephone lines, or actually the cable company's never going to come out. So this is probably more rural America, and even around the globe here is where we'll see this connection. And with Starlink coming on board with their own set of constellation of satellites, it's going to become more and more popular in that sense. Now, Wes, this last one, I actually think you're joking about this, but I did actually see it. WISP. What in the world is WISP?
WISP. I don't know. Man, it sounds like a new sports drink or something. No, that is actually another acronym. That's Wireless Internet Service Provider. And this is more of a generic term because technically, if you think about it, a satellite communication is a wireless provision, right? But what this is this is like cellular, if you will. This is like your 5G cellular technologies, if you will, your satellite communications. It's used for the same purposes. In rural areas where we're not close enough to the telco to provide DSL, we don't have cabling, those networks aren't even present, maybe they're limited, we can have wireless communications and gain access to the internet. These use a variety of technologies, not something, I think, beyond the scope of an exam certification or even a support role, but I want you to know they use a variety of technologies. Some use things like our 802.11 wireless Wi-Fi mesh networks. Some of them use the 2.4 gigahertz industrial, scientific, and medical band, the 5 gigahertz network, 60 gigahertz as well. It's all different types of technologies that are used in a variety of frequencies. But like all wireless communications, kind of like Ronnie and I have mentioned, there are two things that are challenging to wireless internet service providers, and one is the line of sight that we've talked about. Satellite too, it's a line of sight communication, and if you don't have that line of sight, you start to run the risk of having performance degrading on you. The other thing is non-line of sight signal propagation. There are technologies that say, hey, I don't have to have a direct line of sight, but if you talk about deploying this in a metropolitan area type network, well, here's the issue. you might have reflections, you might have signal degradation over that. So there are some challenges, but one of the key takeaways is where we cannot provide things like bounded media, DSL, and cable connections, we can potentially go to a wireless internet service provider and gain internet connectivity.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
Did you know that there's a lot of different network types? Well, you're about to actually find out all about them next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Well, there are a lot more different network types than when I began, and here to actually tell us more about them is going to be Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, when I first started networking, there were like 3 types. Now there's like at least a handful.
That's right, there are. Yeah,
No.
there are. And what we're going to do in this episode is help you to be able to identify those different network types so that if you're in a certification endeavor, you'll be able to get them right. If you're in a support endeavor, and maybe you're just having a conversation with the IT team, you'll be able to have that conversation.
All right, sounds like a lot for us to cover, so head on over to the bench.
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me. And I've gone ahead and this is really going to be some diagrams, because when we start mentioning the various network types that we have, it really just seems like a whole bunch of acronyms, right? Like for instance, the very first one, PAN. When we talk about pan, I think about something that we cook in. Maybe some of you know Peter Pan, maybe you're thinking of that character, but what is a PAN? Well, a PAN is what's known as a personal area network. And a personal area network is one of the smallest network types that we have. And it typically is something like a computer, maybe a wired printer connected to the computer, maybe a webcam connected to the computer. So it's all of what a single person would use. Think about it as in maybe their cubicle, at their desk, right? That forms a personal area network, and it's one of the smallest ones that we have today, and it's one of the ones that I would be able to identify.
Yeah, so the idea of that, trying to essentially for us categorize each different network type is allowing us to focus in more on the technology and less on trying to figure out everything else. So what we want to talk about next then is probably the confusing one for a lot of people is the idea of a local area network. How is that really different from the idea of a PAN?
Sure. So this is one of the most popular network types that we have today. And a LAN is what is known as a local area network. Let me give you an example. It is a self-contained network, and the specific here for you is to keep in mind that it is a network in a single geographical location, and that's the big one. So if we take something like a company has a series of computers, they got a series of network devices, and we get all the way up to the edge of their network, maybe before they go out to the internet. All of that computer technology, all of the networking technology is what is known as a local area network. Again, it is a single geographical area. And I want you to be able to remember that and identify that, whether you're on a certification endeavor or maybe you're support staff and you are having a conversation with your IT team.
Yeah, a lot of times with these types of local area networks, what we also tend to see in like IP addressing is that this will probably be represented most of the time by those private IP addresses instead of a public IP address, each device inside of a LAN, right?
Definitely, and I like that, what you said there, Ronnie, too, because that's another thing to keep in mind. These are private links, right? All the connections are owned typically by, let's say, your organization. Your organization, they have a series of computers, they have a series of networking devices that attach to those computers and cables. Those are all private links. Your company, your corporation owns those. They are the ones that put them in place, and they are the ones that maintain them. Again, keeping in mind that it's a single geographical location.
All right, we have that idea of a LAN down probably pretty well, but you also have on your list VLANs. How are we going to differentiate that from a LAN?
Well, a VLAN is a little bit different because when we look at a VLAN is what's known as a virtual local area network. And a virtual local area network, really, if you have to think about it, it's the way to divide a switch into multiple switches. Let me show you what I mean. We use these commonly today to be able to group a series of devices within a switch and combine them in a way that they can only communicate with other devices that are in that same grouping. That becomes what's known as a VLAN. Notice that we got a single switch, but we have 3 VLANs. Maybe I have some workstations and some printers, and I don't want every device within my network to be able to talk to my servers, right? Maybe security purposes, maybe compliance purposes. So in a managed switch, you can configure it where a group of ports are like their own isolated local area network. That's why we call it a virtual local area network, because it's done in software. For instance, we need our voice over IP phones to be able to operate efficiently and quickly, right? No delay in communications. Well, one of the things that we can do is we can create a VLAN, and we can actually just go ahead and put them within their own virtual local area network. The big takeaway for a VLAN is just to be able to remember that it's a way we can take a managed switch and treat it like it's multiple switches. And it's a great technology today, because if we didn't have this technology and you needed multiple, if you will, VLANs, and you didn't have that, think about it, you'd have to buy another switch. Every time you wanted to create another one of these groupings, I'd have to go out and buy another switch. But with managed switches today and the software that runs on them, we can actually use software to divide them up and treat them as though they are different switches altogether.
Yeah, with that, that's kind of really a good business savings for a company. Instead of buying 3 different switches, to actually be able to buy one managed switch, maybe a little bit expensive at the beginning, but then you can actually chop it up logically and divide up what you need to, and really only have to manage one device instead of multiple devices as well. All right, now that we kind of understand that idea of the LAN a little bit more, and that PAN as well, and even VLANs a little bit, we need to talk about how that skips us to the realm of a WAN, a WAN.
Yeah, there we go. So when we talk about the WAN, we're talking about a wide area network. Now, it's interesting because this uses a combination of public and private links. Public links being typically the ones that are owned by the ISPs, and private links, ones that are owned by the corporation. Well, where are the private links set? Well, a WAN typically spans multiple geographical locations, and a lot of times we use it to connect multiple local area networks together, right? So for instance, remember our LAN 1 here. We've got a series of computers. Let's say maybe we've got a series of computers in Boston. Maybe we've got a series of computers over in Tampa, right? And we connect them with ISP links, and the whole entire network, if you will, becomes what's known as a wide area network. So 2 of the key takeaways when we're comparing LAN and WAN: LAN, single geographical location; a WAN, typically multiple geographical locations, and it also uses public links provided by the ISP or your internet service provider.
Yeah, this is actually probably one of the more useful, I shouldn't say useful, it's probably one of the more prevalent technologies that you will end up a lot of times having to at least understand what is happening when people say they can't get connected out to the internet. It could be an issue with the WAN link that you actually have, or it could be something on the internal side as well. Now, Wes, the next one here is a MAN, an M-A-N. What is that?
That's a metropolitan area network, and this is where it starts to get a little confusing, right? WANs typically span farther than a city, and that's one of the things to keep in mind. A lot of times your WANs, they can go cross states, all right? A MAN doesn't. When we talk about a metropolitan area network is a group of devices that communicate across the city. All right, that's a metropolitan area network, but it doesn't span past the city's boundaries typically. That's a metropolitan area network, where the WAN can go beyond the city limits, can go beyond the state limits, even beyond international limits when it comes down to it. MANs do not. Metropolitan area networks are ISPs providing connectivity within city limits.
Yeah, this is kind of neat because it allows then for maybe in a certain geographical location around the idea of the city limits to have super high speed connections, but then it also fits into WANs for cities that actually, may actually go across different geographical boundaries as well. So they all kind of are interdependent in that way. Our last one here, Wes, is a SAN.
All right, this is what's known as a storage area network. And one of the big things about a storage area network is it really is a large network that is used. It uses a few things. For instance, I can show you just a basic type of storage area network. It uses highly optimized, a lot of times fiber optic communications, specialized switches that are connected to these large storage arrays, right? And the whole entire network, that fabric and all of high-speed fiber communications, very specialized switches, becomes what's known as a storage area network. Now, Ronnie, I didn't put this one in the list, but I do want to go ahead and just briefly talk about this one, because this is one, and I don't know if you were like me, but I would see a SAN, and then I would see this thing called a NOS, and I'm like, well, what did they do? Just reverse the acronym? And essentially they did. A storage area network is used in enterprise-level environments where they need high-speed, very low latency access to the storage devices that they're connected to. We're talking about high enough speeds that you could do things like electronic fund transfers and you don't see a delay. It is very expensive technology. However, if you're a smaller business and you can't afford the hundreds of thousands of dollars that it could potentially take to spin up a whole storage area network, then what you could do is you could put a highly optimized, dedicated single device within your network, what's known as a network-attached storage device. Ladies and gentlemen, just keep in mind that what we're talking about here is nothing more than like a file server. It is a device that has a small footprint, highly optimized operating system on it, and a bunch of storage drives in it that has a network connection, typically gets an IP address, and the users within your networks can store and retrieve information on this. This is a extremely lower cost implementation if you cannot afford a storage area network. I went ahead and put this one in there because if it shows up, I want you to be able to explain it. I want you to be able to identify it. Remember, storage area networks, highly optimized, fiber optic communications where you need low latency, fast speeds, very expensive, done in enterprise level networks. Network attached storage, it could be a small office, home office. It could be just a medium-sized business. They could afford that type of storage, and it becomes really nothing more than like a file server. But it's a dedicated device just being used for storage. These are some of the varieties of network types that I would be able to identify, whether you're in a certification exam or you're just in a support role. If you can do that, you're going to be successful.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
There are a ton of different networking tools that you will actually use as an IT professional. Find out what those are next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Who doesn't actually like working with different tools? Well, in networking, there are plenty of them. And here, Mr. Wes Bryan is going to actually help us to understand them more. So what are we going to talk about?
Sure, we're going to be looking at some tools that we use to create our twisted pair cabling as well as test those cables, maybe even find those cables when we need to. We're also going to look at some things that we can utilize in order to analyze and test out our wireless networks too.
All right, there looks like a ton of different tools over there on the bench. Why don't we head on over?
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me. And that is right. We're going to look at a variety of tools here. And I'm going to start on this side over here. It's going to be my left. And we're going to work our way across the board. And really a first few of these, I would say really about this much of them are all dedicated to doing things like creating and testing cabling, right? So let's go ahead and look at the first one they call out. This is what they call out as a cable stripper, all right? And what this does is this allows you to remove, if we take a closer look at this, this allows you different sizes, if you will, to remove the outer protective coating from the conductors inside of a twisted pair cable. And it's important to be able to identify that because that helps us to remove things like the shielding from the cable. Now, when we need to apply things like our RJ45 jacks, right, our Ethernet cables, we need to have the appropriate plastic connectors at the end. That's called termination, if you will, but it's essentially just attaching a connector to the end of the cable that's going to be plugged into an RJ45 jack on your network adapter, your motherboard, or if you will, maybe ports on a switch. And in order to properly attach those ends, we use something like this. This is called a cable crimper. And this one right here is a more popular brand. This is a Klein crimper. And one of the things that you're going to notice right here is we've got a series of the RJ jacks, if you will, the registered jacks, right? This one right here is going to be our 8P8C RJ45 jack for Ethernet. And we have a smaller one right there, and that is the RJ11 jack. That's our 4P4C connector, and that's used for things like telephone lines, dial-up connections, if you will. And what we do is we would arrange the conductors into the back of the RJ45 jack, put the connector in here, and then crimp it down, and it attaches the connector to the cable. And one of the great things about it is it allows this crimper allows the conductors that are in the connector to pierce the jacket, making connection to the copper conductors inside, thereby allowing us to create a cable itself. Now, there's another type of crimper that I would also be aware of. You might work in an area where maybe you're doing coaxial cabling as well. This is another type of crimper here. This is a coaxial crimper, and this allows you to crimp cables, if you will, on things like your RG6 and RG59 cables. So a couple different types of cable crimpers when it comes to the variety of copper cabling that you might have to make these cables for.
Yeah, creating cables a lot of times, right, should be a rite of passage for somebody who's actually working on the A+ exam, or actually trying to do it for the first time. In other words, at least make one using some of these tools, and that will get you experience. Most of the time, when you're actually working in an environment, more than likely it will be the idea of speed and cost versus your time in creating cables. If you're actually wiring an entire building and you have to make 500 of these things, you might find out the time and the effort behind it is actually going to be worth you actually paying for it instead. Now, Wes, once we actually have this cable created, we plug it in, and it should just magically work, but we should do something with it before we actually say we're going to put it into use, right? And that's where we start moving into the realm of testing.
That's right. What was the saying? Trust but verify, right? And if you've ever wired a cable like I have, chances are you might actually have to start over again, because you think it's good, but then when you go to test it, your cable tester doesn't actually let you know that it's good. And that's the next one. These are cable testers, and they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. This is a small one that we have, and you can see what it does is it allows you to test RJ45 and RJ11 jacks. And what we have here is one section is going to be where you connect one end of the cable. You can see the RJ11, the RJ45, and the RJ11 jacks there. And I would connect one end of the cable into this box and then turn it on, and we've got a series of LEDs, and the LEDs would flash and let me know which conductors are wired right, and it would light up these LEDs. But before I did that, I would take the other end of the cable and I would plug it into this side. And what we would do is we could verify that the cables are wired correctly, wired according to the standard, and that we can send a signal through them. So cable testers, this is a wired Ethernet and PSTN line, or the old telephone jack cable testers. So these, again, come in a variety of sizes, but they allow you to test the cabling. They also let you to test, maybe you're not making a cable. Maybe you have a cable that somebody calls in and they say, I'm getting some intermittent performance, intermittent connectivity loss, right? We find out maybe somebody set a cable down or a desk down on the corner of a cable, right? We need to diagnose and troubleshoot them. We could use a cable tester to see if those cables are actually, still maintaining their integrity. So very handy tool to have, and one I would be able to identify.
Yeah, along with that type of tester, which is good at actually verifying that the cable was made correctly, but there are times where it's also something that we need to do is verify that we're actually going to be testing the right cable too, and that becomes a little bit more difficult, especially in places like wiring closets where you actually have bundles of cable as well. So Wes, what type of tool do we use there?
All right, this is generically called in the industry the Fox and the Hound, more commonly called the tone generator, and it's really in combination. They talk about a toner probe, right? The toner probe is only really one half of the equation here, because a toner probe, I've got a couple of these toner probes right here. So we can see that generically they are called wire trackers, right? Here's another cable tracker. This is actually the toner probe, if you will, and you can see that it's got a tip on it, and it goes with an associated base. All right, and this base is what's known as the tone generator. You can see right here that what this would do would allow me to connect this to the cables, and then, like Ronnie said, I could take this part of it, the toner probe, and I could go into that server closet and I could touch it to a series of the cables, the different cables. Ronnie said maybe hundreds of cables coming out of a bundle, and I could touch it to each one until it would do something like this. If I could show you closely, we can see this one actually light up. If I turn this one on, you're going to notice that it's got a blinking light, right? And what will happen is it lets me know that it's sending signal. And when I come to the cable and it locates the appropriate cable, what is going to end up happening, hopefully, is we're going to see that we have a blinking light. Now, let's do transparency here. It's generating the signal, and because I'm so close to the signal, that's why it's detecting. And notice as I get away. But that's the same thing that would happen in your server closet. I would touch that to that cable, and when it found the right one, you can hear the little sound that it makes. It lets me know that I've found the appropriate cable. Like I said, in the industry, generically, they call it the Fox and the Hound for certification endeavors and support endeavors. Remember, it's a toner probe with a tone generator as well.
Yeah, these are very handy when you are working with a lot of different cables that aren't labeled exactly properly, and you're still having to trace down that one. And then from that point, you can use that cable tester to verify if the cable is also wired correctly, if you happen not to have been part of the premise wiring team that actually put everything together too. Now, even with that, right, we also have to actually think about that idea of premise wiring when we start talking about creating a termination point. So what do we use there?
Sure, Ronnie. So you talked about that. Let's follow along the cable trail here. Ronnie, you mentioned that big bundle of cable coming into your server closet, maybe has hundreds of twisted pair implementations, right? Well, where do they actually connect, if you will, in your server closet? Well, what they do is they're hardwired with each individual wire inside of each cable being hardwired into the back of what's known as a patch panel. Well, how do we strip off the outside coating like our cable stripper does, embed and then cut off the excess when we're embedding those wires into the back of a patch panel? Well, that's where this little device comes in, and this is what's known as a punch-down tool. Now, let me see if I can get this. There we go. All right, and what you're going to see is that it's got an impact adjustment, and what that does is how far down out this the tip will go, and you'll see that there's like a V shape on that tip, and that V shape actually has a little blade in it. And what we do is we press down on the conductor within the back of the patch panel, and what you'll hear, let me see if I can make it, you'll hear that click. That's why it's called a punch down tool. And it strips, it embeds, and then cuts off with this little blade the excess. Now, Ronnie, I have to give people a little bit of a warning here. And when I first got into, well, Ronnie's already laughing. He knows where I'm going with this one. When I first got into the industry, I didn't pay attention to which side. And let me show you here. You might get a kick out of this. If you can see, do you see the little scissors option? That lets you know which way is going, which side is going to be cut off when it comes to the excess that's trimmed off after you punch it down into the back of the patch panel. Well, if you don't have that scissor on the right side, then what you do is you strip, embed, and then trim and cut it back out of its connection point. So make sure that you have it turned the right way so that when you embed it and punch it down, the excess is actually cut off, and you don't turn around and just cut the wire back off of the patch panel. Live and learn, I've been there, but that's your punch down tool. It's used to terminate wires in a server closet to the back of a patch panel.
All right, we also hear the use, at least we used to hear the use of the idea of a loopback plug. What does that help us to do?
Sure. So the loopback plug, it really isn't fancy. Like all the tools that we have out here, this one you almost can't see. So thank goodness we can take a little bit of a closer look, right? A loopback plug is essentially made up of an RJ45 jack that takes the transmit pins and sends them out and back into the receive pin. So what we have is this loop that's created between the transmit pins within a network adapter and the receive. You might say TX, RX, send and receive. So what does that allow us to do? Well, that allows me to test the electrical capabilities of the network adapter. See, we have other technologies logically in software that we can find out, does the network adapter know its name and software? And that's where we use network utilities like the ping utility to ping our loopback address. But that all stays in software. That doesn't actually test the physical capability. Can the network adapter actually send an electrical communication out? That's where the loopback plug comes in. The loopback plug allows you to plug it into the RJ45 jack of the network adapter in question, and you can do things like run your ping utility that sends a little electrical communication out of the adapter, loops it back in, and we can verify that yes, the network adapter from a physical electrical standpoint is functioning the way it should be.
Yeah, you may also, of course, end up using a specialized type of loopback at times on certain devices where it says, hey, for this device to work, it needs to be plugged in. If you don't have another device to plug it in, one of the ways you can kind of trick it is to actually use something like that loopback plug to make it think it's actually really connecting to another device.
Oh, that's
so
a
it actually
sleight of
is
hand.
kind of neat to actually be able to do. Now, along with that, though, we start to actually now have to think about the idea of analyzing data a little bit more. Tell us about the idea of a network tap.
Yeah, so a network tap, this can be a relatively cheap device all the way up to a very expensive device. And network taps, what they allow us to do, I want you to think of tapping into the network. I know it seems obvious, and I apologize, not talking down to anybody, but imagine a way that we've got a cable that's sending signal into a device and then a cable that's sending signal out of that device, right? Well, if I put a tap in between it, and I plug into one side of the tap, I plug an RJ45 jack and then an RJ45 jack on the other side, and it runs into the device, I can now listen in on the communication from source to destination from a specific device. So what I can do is I can use it to analyze if communications are happening. Now, understand we can also do that to monitor traffic as well. It's not the only thing. We're not talking about, hey, we're just eavesdropping on everybody. But what it is it allows us to test that network communications, maybe from a specific device, are happening the way we expect them to do. And we can also troubleshoot it if they're not.
Yeah, by using a network tap, it also gives us the ability to tap into that traffic, but not also cause some type of congestion. So normally if we actually have to capture traffic somewhere, it has to go somewhere, then we can actually capture it. And then, at times it slows things down. With a network tap, we essentially unplug those cables, we plug them in, and that way we can actually capture the data as it goes through those cables and not really slowing anything down in that sense. Now, the reason why we wanted to mention that is because it may be like the only way for us to do it is what we used to call splicing into that physical cable. Well, then we damage the cable. So by using a network tap, we actually say we can do this without damaging it and still get the same information out. Now, Wes, all this is actually good for physical connections, right? Creating the cable, being able to actually test it, all that's actually good. But most of the people are on wireless today. What do we do with that?
Yeah, that's right. We've been looking at more of the bounded media aspect, right, within network communications. But we also have to say, well, what about unbounded media, if you will? Communications that travel through the air, like wireless. Wireless communications, we have another tool out there, and this is a really cool tool, and there's a lot of free ones out there that I would encourage you as maybe exam candidates or maybe support candidates, if you will, maybe you're getting in the help desk role, to go out there and download a Wi-Fi analyzer. I'm actually in my Windows 10 machine, and I've downloaded one that's right from the Microsoft store, and this is just very generically, it's called Wi-Fi analyzer, right? It really isn't anything, the name isn't too spectacular, but what it allows me to do is it allows me to get some details about our network, right? I can see what the signal strength is relative to my network adapter locally here. I can see what the network name is, channels, the frequency. You can see the protocols that are being used, the encryption or security that's being used, a lot of different information, right? But we can go a little bit farther than that too, because we can actually do, well, imagine this, just like the name says, we can analyze the network as well. And to let you know, what we're looking at here is a 5 gigahertz spectrum. And we can see the various access points that are broadcasting their signals across the variety of the 5 gigahertz spectrum here. I could also do this. I could change this over, and we could look at, like, for instance, the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, and we could see a variety of access points that are broadcasting on that frequency as well. And it's a very good way to just get an overall analysis of your wireless network, the signal strength, the surrounding wireless network, so that you can make plans and decisions and even troubleshoot and diagnose the wireless networks within your infrastructure. So Wi-Fi Analyzer, very, very handy utility. You can even go as far, and what I've done, and I know Ronnie's done before, we've actually gotten these on our phones before if we didn't want our laptops, and we could use these and walk around and we could find the various signal strengths of the multiple access points that we have here inside of the IT Pro TV network. I would suggest you all out there as well. Get familiar with a Wi-Fi Analyzer. You don't have to be experts in it, but it is a fabulous tool to have at your disposal, and much of these other tools that you're going to be able to identify, be able to explain their purposes. Whether you're in exam or a support role, you'll be doing well.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.
Network cables are important data pathways for us. What do we need to know about them? Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Is a cable just a cable as a cable? Well, there's only one guy that actually knows, and that's going to be Mr. Wes Bryan here. So Wes, when it comes down to addressing cables, for somebody that's new, this may be a little bit more confusing than we think, and they may grab the wrong cable. So where are we going to begin here?
Well, we're going to do that. We're going to demystify the fact that, well, we don't have one cable to rule them all, if you will. It'd be nice if we have that, but there are different situations in which we might need to recommend a cable. And whether you're going to sit a certification exam, you're going to have to know things like specifications, but also if you're in a support role, it's important to understand, what is the difference between things like copper and fiber, and we're going to address that here in this episode.
All right, I see a whole bunch of cables over at the bench. Why don't we head on over there?
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me where it looks like we are serving up multicolored spaghetti over here. I swear that is not what we're doing. But what we've got is we've got a series of network cables. And if you're going to sit a certification exam, they might put you in a scenario where you might need to be able to identify, one of these many different cable types that we have. And we'll talk about them each individually. One of the first things I want to talk about is really the most prevalent media type, network cable type that we have in the industry today. And it's one that's been around for a very long time. And it's also one that you can see not only in enterprise level networks, but you can see most commonly in residential networks too. And I want to talk about something known as copper-based network media. I'm going to be using that term, so network cables, network media. Keep in mind that these are the cables that we send electrical communications across. And they are really some of the oldest network cables. And we've got a series of standards that we have followed, we follow over the years. Because remember that when we talk about standardization, standardization is a good way that you can easily identify what are the electrical capabilities of the cable. And if you're going to make a recommendation for people, even if you're in a home environment, even if you're in a support environment, maybe you're not sitting the certification exam, that you can understand what are some of those benefits and then what are some of the pros and cons that we might see out of copper media.
Yeah, when it comes down to it though, Wes, today, there really is only one kind of copper cabling that we use for networking. In the past, though, we had so many different ones, it would actually be a little bit more challenging to choose. But for us, we really need to focus in on just a few things. What are those going to be?
Well, sure, Ronnie. And that one right there that we have, the most common one, really when it comes to copper media, is going to be something known as a twisted pair cabling. Now, twisted pair cabling, if we look at a close-up view here over on our little cam, it doesn't really look like much, right? We can see a sheathing, we can see a couple of connectors that we're going to talk about, but ultimately at the end of the day, it really doesn't look like much. So it's what's inside of that cable that we really need to be able to identify. And when we look at this cable, I've gone ahead and what I've done is I had one of our directors back there in our production team. We've got a bundle of this twisted pair implementation back there, and I said, hey, do you mind grabbing me a piece of this and we can kind of dissect it. So that's what we've done here for you, so you can kind of see. And when we look at twisted pair implementations, what you're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, is that you have 8 copper conductors, right? These 8 copper conductors are actually twisted into 4 pairs. Now, certification exam, let's talk a little bit about some of the nomenclature that you might see on the exam. How many twisted pairs do we have? 4. How many twisted conductors do we have? right? So pay attention to the verbiage. And you also want to know that, ladies and gentlemen, honestly, like I said, if you're in a support desk role or, help desk, support desk, and again, depending on what your terminology is there, it is important to understand, just some of the characteristics of these cables. Now, let's talk a little bit about the twists that we see here within this cable here. What do the twists actually do for us, right? You can see there's a bunch of twists, right? And I just kind of untwisted the top so we could see the individual conductors. Well, what those twists do inside of your cable is they allow they increase its immunity to electromagnetic interference. And that's really important. The twists in the cable are actually built that way to help with protecting against electromagnetic interference and any kind of unwanted signal. And there are a couple of different types that we need to be aware of. There are what is known as UTP, and we have what's known as STP. Now, what we're showing you here right now, everyone, this is actually what's known as UTP, all right? U stands for unshielded, and then TP, if you will, stands for twisted pair, amongst other things. But you can see that if you need a greater immunity to electromagnetic interference, that there will also be a foil shielding around these, all of these conductors, and that increases, right? Increases even more the immunity of this cable to electromagnetic interference. Now, it's not completely immune to it. Now, let's just understand that. And you could have some that go even farther than that, expensive cables that not only put a shield around all of the conductors, but actually shield each individual pair. All right, so where would you maybe need something that has that so much shielding? Well, I want you to think about it. If you can't get around using other media that we're going to talk about, something like fiber optic media, and you have to use copper media, but let's say you're running it next to an elevator shaft. Let's say you're running it next to a HVAC system, heating, ventilation, and AC that gives off a lot of electromagnetic interference, right? Well, in those implementations, you're going to want to be running shielded twisted pair, right? Because of the resiliency to magnetic interference. Now, I will tell you though, that's not always the case. Sometimes when you talk about higher speeds and specifications, sometimes they need the shielding because to get these massive speeds, 10 gigs and beyond, some even today can go up to 40 gigs in very short runs, they do not do well with any unwanted signal, which is just interference. So you might be required according to the standard. So how do we make connections? All right, well, we make connections to these twisted pairs right here through something known as an RJ45 jack, right? The RJ45 jack stands for Registered Jack 45, and there's a whole bunch of different standards, ladies and gentlemen, but the big one about this is to also know that it's called an 8P8C connector, because there are 8 copper conductors, if you will, right, pins, and what we do is we wire our connections into the back. We wire these conductors into the back of the RJ45 jack, and then we take a cable crimper, and what we do is we tighten it down. All right, and when we crimp it down, it essentially adheres this connector right to the end of this cable. And that's important. So the RJ45 jack, I want you to know, RJ45 is the registered jack, or the way that we terminate our Ethernet cables.
Yeah, this is important, and the reason why is because just about every device is going to connect to a network of some sort, whether it's networking equipment or even on the back of your computer, it will accept that jack that has now been standardized throughout the entire industry. So if you try and actually plug a cable in that doesn't have that jack, well, whatever device you're trying to plug it in there is not going to accept it. So pretty much the entire industry has standardized around this, which makes it easy because it means you don't have to carry around a bunch of different types of connectors in the end. And the other thing that I want you to actually pay attention to as well, you may hear the term terminating a cable. When you put a connector on the end of a cable like what Wes just showed you, you are terminating that cable so it can now be plugged into something else. So all those are actually kind of weird terminologies, but you'll hear them throughout the industry called different things. So make sure you actually know that too.
I like that, Ronnie, that you said that, because you and I, if you're first getting into this industry, what would we call it? Well, we're applying a connector to the end of it. But that termination standard, again, it's some of the jargon that you should be aware of, and don't let it confuse you if you hear somebody refer to that. Now, One of the things that we've been talking about is the internal makeups of the cable. We've talked about its conductors and what the twists do, how many conductors you have, as well as, like Ronnie mentioned, the termination of the cable. How do we put a connectivity jack on the end of it? Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus in, everyone here, on the jacketing itself. So jacketing there's nothing really fancy about it, doesn't really look like much. We've got different colors and sometimes for different specifications and stuff. But it is important to understand that there's two different types of jacketing. There's what is known as PVC jacketing, and there's what's known as plenum. I'm going to say there's what's known as plenum and non-plenum, all right? So let's talk about non-plenum, and I know I'm doing these a little bit backwards because you have cables like this and really cables like this, and probably most of the cat cables that I have, or the twisted pair cables, I should say, that I have in front of me that are using the PVC connector. And again, there's nothing really to see here because what is PVC? Polyvinyl chloride. PVC jacketing, we have issues with this. PVC jacketing can be used for things like drop cables that are not in plenum spaces. Big technical jargon for open air handling spaces with HVAC systems between your walls, right? Now, if these basic non-plenum PVC based jacketing were to ever burn, it would give off a toxic gas. And the other thing I want you to notice here about this cable is very easy to work with, right? And there's some space. You can kind of see some space in between those connectors right there. Now that space can allow air to pass through it, all right? And if you need to run cabling that will pass fire code and fire inspections when burnt does not give off a toxic gas, and our jacket is really tightly wrapped to the central copper conductors, then that's where plenum comes in. Plenum does not give off a toxic gas, and it's very stiff cabling to work with, Ronnie. It's kind of frozen, if you will. You don't have to go into the frigid northeast to have a hard time working with these cables. Because of that, it's what's going to be used inside of air handling spaces in your structured cabling. So plenum, something for fire code, non-toxic when burnt, very tight fitting, if you will, to those copper conductors used in the air handling or plenum spaces, as they call it. PVC is commonly called non-plenum, and that's going to be used for things like drop cables, those non-plenum or non-HVAC kind of implementations today.
All right, so Wes, if I just find any network cable that's out there, that should actually be able to work for anything I want, right?
Well, you would think so. For instance, we look at these cables and there really doesn't look like there's much difference to them. But unfortunately, that's not the case. There's a little organization called TIA. They used to be called TIA, but EIA doesn't exist anymore. TIA is the Telecommunication Industry Association, and they are the company, the standards body, if you will, that's formally endorsed by the American National Standards Institute that defines the electrical capabilities of these cables, and they do that through specifications. And some of the specs that we have to talk about are what are known as CAT cables. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of these type of subjects that if you are in some kind of, you're going to sit the certification exam, then you're going to need to know these specifications. But you also have to know, is it okay if we just, we recommend a Cat 5E cable over maybe a Cat 6A cable? And what does that even mean? So TIA formally defines them under what are known as category standards. And a lot of times we just abbreviate that. We call them CAT cables, right? Well, the categories have been around for a very long time. And some of the ones that you used to have to know would be starting with what was known as a Cat 3 cable, and the Cat 3 cable was what was known as one of the earliest Ethernet twisted pair cablings. But today, there are just a few of them that I need you to be aware of for the certification exam, and that's Cat 5, Cat 5E, Cat 6, and Cat 6A. Now, that's a mouthful of specifications. Let's talk a little bit about those. Cat 5, that is what is known as fast Ethernet, and it allows 100 megabit transfer speeds. All right. You have then what is known as Cat 5E, and Cat 5E came out, it's an enhanced, Cat 5E, if you will, Cat 5 enhanced, and there was a real big push towards gigabit Ethernet. but we weren't quite there yet. And Cat5e could support gigabit Ethernet speeds at very short distances, so they called it gigabit Ethernet. Although technically it's rated for about 350 megabits per second sustain. And I want you to know that. I want you to know what the name is: Cat5, fast Ethernet, Cat5e, gigabit Ethernet. But then we get into Cat6, all right? And when we look at Cat6, Cat6 is the first true standardized gigabit speeds, and here's the kicker, out to what's known as 100-meter cable length. All twisted pair implementations, to make it easier for some of your flashcards, have a maximum transmission distance of 100 meters or 328 feet. Anything past that, and you get what's known as signal degradation, it just deteriorates the signal. You can run into things like timing issues. So that's the specification regardless of what Cat cables we're talking about. When Cat 6 came out, they said this is going to be the first cable that it is endorsed for gigabit speeds at the full distance of the cable. But then, as time progressed, we started getting into 10 gigabit networks. Well, believe it or not, Cat 6 can support a 10 gigabit transmission distance, but not at 100 meters. It greatly reduces it to about 55 meters. And that's where Cat 6 augmented. Cat 6A comes into play, because Cat 6A is the formal TIA specification that will allow you to make and hit a 10 gigabit Ethernet network at a full 100 meters. All right, now there's other ones out there that you don't really have to worry about. You might come across a Cat 7 once in a while. That's not formally endorsed by TIA, and that was because when they came out with that cable, they did not want to go with the traditional RJ45 jack. They wanted some special jack to go along with that. So if you see that out there, it's not officially endorsed, but I definitely would know 5, 5E, 6, and 6A. Know their names like we've told you about. Fast Ethernet, gigabit Ethernet, know what the transmission speeds are, as well as the maximum distance, and that can always help you out, because regardless of the Cat implementation or the Ethernet implementation, the maximum transmission distance is always going to be 100 meters.
Yeah, this idea of actually understanding those specifications, we can clearly see a lot of times on the actual cable jacketing itself, and that will allow us to at least be able to, when we pick up a cable, to know what we're actually trying to get to, right?
Thank you, Ronnie. You know, that's a great reminder, and Ronnie's absolutely right. Let me show you what Ronnie's talking about right here in the front of that cable, just past the mono price. You can see Cat 6, right? Just barely right there. So that lets me know that this is a Cat 6 cable. You can also see this on your other cables. You can see Cat 5, Cat 5e, if you will, maybe even 6a. So it's really easy to identify the cabling based on its shielding. Also, if you have to purchase these products, remember that if you get a spool of these, the twisted pair cabling that you're going to be making your own cables, you can also identify it on the spool as well, too.
Yeah. Now, when we actually create these cables, though, you said that there's 8 different conductors. There has to be some sort of specification to actually being able to terminate them correctly, or is the cable just going to work no matter how we terminate them?
Yeah, Ronnie, you know, we would say that it'd be the wild, wild west, but the problem is when you have these long cable runs, you need to ensure that you are going to wire them into the back of the RJ45 jacks consistently. And that's why TIA also has a standard out there that's called the 568 commercial building standard, and a subset of that is how we essentially wire these jacks, right? So we've got our twisted pair implementation, we've got a series of color coding here, and we've got our RJ45 jack, and we need to make sure that we wire the arrangement on this side the same on this side. All right, so there are 2 standards that I want you to be aware of. There's what is known as an 568A, and there's 568B. All right, and all these do is they define how you arrange the wiring, the conductors, and then crimp them into the back of the cabling. All right, now, a lot of times you'll see that cabling like this will be a 568B wiring scheme, if you will. It's important for you to know if you're sitting a certification exam that if I have what's known as, take any one of the standards, 568A on one side, 568A on the other side, or 568B on one side, 568B on the other. That becomes what's known as a straight-through cable because they are identically wired on each side. All right, and pins 1 and 2 are what we call your transmit pins. Pins 6 and 3 within, or conductor, if you will, 6 and 3 are the receive pins. And if they match pins 1 and 2, wiring matches pins 1 and 2 on this side, then it's what's known as a straight through cable. And these were commonly used to plug into the back of your workstations, into the wall plates, the wall jacks on the wall there. Now, if I take one of those standards, 568A on this side and 568B on this side, then what I'm doing is internally I'm taking pins 1 and 2 and pins 3 and 6, and I'm crossing them over from one side of the cable to the next. That becomes a crossover cable. And these are very, very good. When you need to test a point-to-point connection, let's say between two laptops, and you don't want to put a switch in the middle, a connectivity device in the middle of them, then you can directly plug these into the network adapters, and they can communicate back and forth, and they don't need a connectivity device. Another practical application of a crossover cable is when you need to do maybe some configurations on an IP camera, and you don't want to plug them into a connectivity device. You want to go from the port on your laptop straight into the back of the IP camera. If you have 568A on one side and B on the other side, you've now crossed those cables, creating a point-to-point connection that you no longer need a connectivity device for.
Right, so that actually is something that's very helpful that you may have to correct if somehow that connector gets crushed underneath the wheel of a desk chair. Somebody walks on it and crushes it. So you repairing that cable, understanding the standards on both sides is going to be very helpful as you put that particular cable back together. Now, Wes, this is not the only type of copper cabling that we have. We still need to talk about coaxial cable, right?
That's right. Coaxial cable's a little bit different than our twisted pair. And why do we say that? Well, a coaxial cable, such as, like, for instance, the one I have, they talk about it is a single, and let's journey right in here. You can see just a single copper post right there in the middle. That's the coaxial cable. All right, and it's important to understand that when we have coaxial cable, we only have a single copper connector. And then the way the coaxial cable is made up of is we have that centralized copper conductor, and then what we have is a non-electric shielding around that cabling, and then a braided shielding around that to help reduce the electromagnetic interference. And then finally, we have a jacket around the outside of these. Now, when we look at the coaxial cabling, there are two different standards that I want you to be aware of. One standard that's been around for a very long time, and it's still used today, and the other one, like this one that I have here, that is more of a common standard, or more becoming more of the commonality. All right, and what I'm talking about is RG59 and RG6. These two cable types are the coaxial cable types that we pretty much are using today. And for instance, and the same thing goes with these, Ronnie. You can see the RG59. It's a little bit different than RJ. RG is radio grade. It goes back to an old military standard that's really not used anymore, but they still follow some of the numbering. This one right here, this thinner one, this is what's known as an RG59 cable. And what I'd like to do is kind of just put these two cables side by side, and you can see this is an RG6 cable. This RG6 cable is a lot thicker today. All right, so these are the two cables that we used to use them in networking. Today, more than anything, they're not really used in networking, but what they are used for, and you can ask any one of our directors back here that's connected any coaxial cable to one of our cameras, it's heavily used in AV, audio and video production here. So that's your RG59 cable, and that's your RG6 cable. These are two coaxial cables that I would be able to identify today. And the connectors that they use are what are known as BNC connectors. So if we look right here, you can see that there's this little sleeve here, and it's kind of a twist to lock type connector. The outside kind of twists and it locks. And I'm going to grab the RG59 because it's a little easier to use. All right, and this is what's known as a T connector. And that's how we make terminations, if you will, on split our coaxial cables. The BNC connector is one of the most common coaxial termination methods today. All right, it's a standard that's been around for a very long time. I think it's Bayonet Neil Conkelman is one of the many names that it's accredited towards. These just happen to be T connectors, and these can essentially split a coaxial communication into three different signals. You have things like this where it's an L bracket. It's still a BNC connector that goes to a 45. And again, kind of show you here, it is a twist to lock implementation. All right, so those are the connectors. Now there's one other connector that I don't have up there, but I would encourage any of you that has a cable internet connection, if you're using cable television, and that's the F connector. The F connector is typically what you see goes back into the back of your modems. These are the two most prevalent copper media types that we have today, and it is something I would be aware of and know the specifications that we've talked about for your certification exams, as well as if you're in a support role so that you can make the right decisions if people come to you for that.
Now, with copper media, no matter what size it is subject to things like the electromagnetic interference and radio frequency interference. But we want to talk about fiber optic as well, because we're starting to see more and more of that in the world, right?
That's right. Fiber optics, if it would have been 10 or 15 years ago, we wouldn't really be talking about fiber optics in anything except for just enterprise level networks today. But the price of fiber optic communications has kind of come down as the technologies become more prevalent. But there are a couple of cables that I want you to be able to be aware of. So when we talk about fiber optic type cables, we have a couple of varieties. All right, we have what's known as single mode fiber, and we have what's known as multi-mode fiber. When we talk about single mode fiber cabling, if you will, sometimes abbreviated SMF, is the longest what we call bounded transmission media on the planet. What I mean by being bounded, right? We're still bounded to a physical cable. These can run kilometers, all right? And that's due to how the signal's propagated down a single mode fiber cable, if you will. It has a jacketing. It has a cladding that's about 125 microns thick, and then the core that's inside of that, it's around 9 microns thick. And again, that's an absolute just amazing. We're talking about 9 millionths, I believe, of a meter here when we say microns. Very, very, very small. And so I want you to know that, right? A very small, concentrated 9 micron core, and the light source is a laser essentially shot down like a rifle shot down through the center of this core. The core is highly concentrated, so it has the farthest signal propagation. The other one is what is known as multi-mode fiber, and multi-mode fiber are called MMF. You will see has a little bit different of the variation. The cladding is still 125 microns in diameter, but the cores can either be 50 or they can be 62.5 microns, and what they do is they actually refract the light, bouncing it off the cladding to propagate the signal, if you will, down that cable to the end. Now, due to the fact that the tolerances in single mode are so tight, you get a farther signal propagation. Due to the fact that the cores are not as concentrated in multi-mode fiber, you do not get the same amount of distance out of a multi-mode fiber cable that you would a single mode cable too. Now, a couple of connections that I would be aware of. We've actually got both of them on one cable. There is an older one, and that older one is what is known as a subscriber connector. And we can kind of take a look at this here. The subscriber connectors, in fact, Ronnie, the two connectors that they want, they're both on this cable. Right here is what's known as an SC connector, right? That's a subscriber connector. And what we have here is we actually have two fibers. This is what's known as a duplexing cable because it allows us to send and receive over two pairs of fibers, if you will. Now, the other one that you see on this cable as well is the newer. This is actually a compatibility cable with older standards. And the newer standard here is what's known as the Lucent connector. That's the LC connector. You can see that it's about half the size, and that's because port density, the amount of ports you have on a single connectivity blade within, like for instance, a switch, they've gotten smaller and smaller. And because of that, we can fit twice as many of these into a connectivity device as we could the earlier subscriber connector. You can see they're about double the size. Now, staying right there, you can see a cable that is a little bit more modern, right? And it has two of the Lucent connectors, or Lucent, I know I keep saying Lucent, but it's Lucent connectors, LC connector, if you will. And if you're in a certification exam, one of the things that I usually admonish our students for is that if you have to remember which one's which, the Lucent connector, I want you to think little connector. It's half the size of the subscriber connector. These are the fiber optic cables, and the connectors that we use to terminate them, like you heard Ronnie say in an earlier statement. Everybody out there, if you're sitting your certification exam, I would definitely know these specifications, make flashcards, and if you're in a support role, I would also know the specifications so that if somebody comes to you asking you these questions, you can make the right decisions.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.